Well, team, it's been a long journey, but at long last, we have arrived at the final edition of Indicator Plants of BC, broadcast from the Messy Loft studio. This time, group number 8, we have our mosses. And oh goodness me, this is what we have been working up towards, team. I am not going to beat around the bush. Mosses are difficult to identify. The fundamental problem? They're such small little plants that it's just hard to see a lot of the features. So if you are really serious about IDing your mosses, then you got to get something like this. And this is just this little jeweler's loupe, like a little magnifying glass basically. I got from Amazon for 10 bucks. It really helps a lot. But people that are super serious about identifying mosses, they actually tell you to look at things like put it under a microscope and check out the shapes of the cells and the cell structure. And it's like, oh my gosh, we can't do that. So this week, this group, we're really just going to do our best, give you a few heuristics to try, the things to try and do your best to identify these in the field. Some are easier than others, but yeah, like it can be quite difficult. So we're going to get a little bit botanical for a second here, and when we're talking about what do I look for when I'm trying to identify a moss. And we just want to make the observation, first of all, that we're talking about moss. We're actually talking about there's potentially two different types of little organisms that you look at. Now, mosses, like all plants, do something which is called alternation of generations when they reproduce. And so basically, that's what this graph over here is illustrating. This basically, you'll have a gametophyte, which is a haploid, which is the haploid generation. It's only got one set of chromosomes, and that will produce its little gametes, like, egg, sperm, that kind of thing. It will produce those via mitosis. Those will fuse, those will fertilize, and they'll fertilize to be the zygote, which will grow into the sporophyte. And so you've got this diploid plant called the sporophyte. The sporophyte undergoes meiosis to produce the spores, and the spores then undergo mitosis to produce new gametophytes. So all plants do this, but mosses are, are unique in that the gametophyte generation is actually really big and dominant, and it's the thing that you're looking at. So when you go out in the woods, the thing that you look at and say, hey, that's moss, that's actually just a little organism that only has one set of chromosomes, which is really cool. So the gametophyte, that's like the leafy thing that you look at. The sporophyte is it almost looks like a little antennae that grows on top of the gametophyte. And we can break our mosses into two basic groups, basically based on the layout of the sporophyte versus the gametophyte. You can have your acrocarpous mosses, where you've got that gametophyte, and then the sporophyte comes right out on top there. And these ones tend to look more like little tiny trees. Then you can have the pleurocarpous mosses, and that's where the sporophyte comes out from kind of the side of the gametophyte. And these ones tend to be kind of just branching and going all over the place and laying over. And so those are two basic morphological distinctions that you can look at. And so what are a few other things that you can look at? Well, if you're looking at the gametophyte, you can look at the patterns of the branching. If you have a little magnifier, you can try and take a look at the leaves as well. If you're looking at the sporophyte, then you might look at other than where it is on the moss, you might also look at the capsule, which is this little thing on the end there. Sometimes the shape of the capsule or its position or the way it looks will tell you. But I'll try and point out these different features for each species. So what do we have? Oh my goodness, we have just a bucket load of mosses this week. I think we've got, what do we have, 11 total. We've got a whole whack of our pleurocarpous mosses. We've got a few Acrocarpus mosses, and then we have the wet and wild Sphagnum. And that's our peat moss, and that just that's actually a genus, it's not a species, and that just sort of, we'll talk about when we get to it. It's kind of its own thing. First off, though, our Pleurocarpus mosses. And the first of our Pleurocarpus mosses is steppe moss. We are starting off easy. Steppe moss is probably the easiest of all of the mosses to identify. Hylocomium splendens. And then, so the scientific name splendens, it suggests what it is. It's a really quite a lovely looking moss when you find it. It looks like a whole bunch of feathers on the forest floor. And basically the reason for that is because it has this funny two pinnate branching structure, and it looks like these big nets or these little feathers that you find just littering the forest floor. And it forms these big mats kind of like this, and it's really quite a lovely moss and very distinctive looking. So why is it called steppe moss though? The reason for that is because it grows in these annual steppes. And so on the very tippy top, you'll have this growing season's growth. Then you go down, and this is the previous season's growth here, last year. And then the year before that, you can see that right below it there. And so right on this moss, you can see the 3 seasons of growth that have occurred in these steppes, for the steppe moss. This photo also gives you a good idea of kind of the net-like pattern when you find it out there. It's this really kind of feathery net-like structure. And here is a photo. I believe this is actually just the start of the next annual season of growth. So this is that next step, and this is what it looks like when it's just starting out like that. Steppe moss. Next up, we have our Oregon beaked moss, Kindbergia oregana. Love it when the name is right there in the common name. So Oregon beaked moss, the way that I recognize this one is it's not as net-like, it's not net-looking like the steppe moss that we just looked at. You find it in lots of the same kinds of areas, but the steppe moss will tend to be more on the forest floor. It loves those kind of organic soils. The Oregon beaked moss loves to grow on dead wood, and so you'll find it growing kind of above the ground, but in the same areas as the steppe moss. And to me, how I identify this one is you look at the branching. And so this is one where the branches always occur basically in one plane. So you can see it looks really flat. You've got branches coming out of this side and branches coming out of this side, but not coming out in the forwards or backwards. And when it does that, it makes it look like a really teeny tiny little fern to me. So you look for those little teeny tiny fern looking mosses on the dead wood. That is your Oregon beaked moss. So here's just a little bit of Oregon beaked moss in the wild. You can see it on the dead wood right here. And then when you pick it up, you can see it's a little bit more three-dimensional, but when it's sitting down on the wood, then it really only looks like the branches are coming out in one direction and another direction. And here is a photo, just a few of the sporophytes poking out. So once again, we got the gametophyte. That's the haploid, leafy part that you look at and say, hey, there's a moss. And then the sporophyte is coming out from the side there because this is a Pleurocarpus moss. Next up, we have our Lanky moss, Rhytidiadelphus loreus. How is that for a scientific name? My God. All right, so Lanky moss, Pleurocarpus moss, lots and lots of branching, really untidy, and this is a really thin, noodly looking little moss, and you find a bunch of this in the forest. To me, it looks a lot like, if you go to your grandma's house and you open her yarn drawer and you see just all the old yarn sitting there and it's all in this big jumble. That's kind of what the Lanky moss looks like to me. And so here's a photo a little bit closer up Now, some authorities say that a good way to identify this is to look for kind of the brown or reddish stems. Yeah, so no, they do typically have pretty apparent brown or reddish stems. A couple other mosses, you can kind of see these brownish or reddish stems though. So, maybe that'll help you. Maybe that isn't quite as useful an identifier. But what you can really see in this photo to the right is kind of the scale of this moss. Yeah, I took this photo, that's my hand, and you can see the really untidy branches. So the branching just comes out all over the place. And another thing which is actually quite important to identify this moss compared to some of the others, look at the ends. So the ends tend to be kind of skinny and kind of come to a little point. Other mosses, especially the electrified cat's tail moss that we're going to look at in a minute, the leaves are all splayed out when you get right to the end there. Here, it just comes into this little point. Now, if you do want to get super botanical and you want to, and that's going to be the way that you identify these leaves, then you can get your magnifier out and you can take a look at them. And the most rigorous way to identify this moss is to try and look for some pleats on the leaves. What do I mean by pleats? I mean that they tend to be folded up at the sides, a little bit like a fan. So imagine how a fan is kind of wrinkled and folded up that way. This moss will have those pleats on the edges. And so in this photo, it's hard to see. You can kind of see a few pleats coming in at the sides there and how the moss looks like it's kind of folded up on the edges. But yeah, really quite difficult to look at. Okay, next up, electrified cat's tail moss. Rhytidiadelphus triquetrus. So you'll notice Rhytidiadelphus, that's the same genus as our Lanky moss. These are mosses that are quite closely related, and these are two mosses that are pretty easy to get confused. One thing that I found kind of helpful was, so I spent a long time trying to identify this moss in the field, and I kept being not sure if I was seeing it and if I was seeing just the Lanky moss. And then I went to Salt Spring Island for a little bit over the summer, and this stuff, it looked exactly like this photo, and it was all over the place. And so electrified cat's tail moss oftentimes like sites that are like a little bit drier than the Lanky moss. So that's a potential. So sometimes you got to look at your environment and think, what might I be looking at based on where I am? But the key thing for telling your electrified cat's tail moss apart from your Lanky moss is to really just look at the tips of those gametophytes there. Now, look how it tends to be kind of standing up a little bit more, and then the tip is all splayed out and going all over the place. Another name for this moss is rough goosenecked moss, and so it's coming up and it's bending over and it looks really rough and untidy. This is opposed to the Lanky moss, which was really coming into more of a point. This one will splay out all over the place. And so here's an electrified cat, just for point of comparison for your electrified cat's tail moss. Photo on the bottom right here, you can see it still has branches kind of coming out all over the place. It doesn't look so much like your grandma's yarn as the Lanky moss does, but really look at the tips of those branches and the way that they're going out. Oh, a little closer up photo to see just the habit of that moss there. Yeah, the branches coming out all over the place. The leaves on the tip of the branches just splaying right out. Okay, next up, Pipecleaner moss. Rhytidiopsis. Rhytidiopsis robusta. Whoo-wee, that's a toughie. So the name robusta, so one of the things to note about this one, sometimes with the mosses, it's useful to think about where you are when you're trying to identify them. Oftentimes our Pipecleaner moss likes to be in more subalpine environments. It likes to be in places, it oftentimes likes places that are just a little bit damper. And so, yeah, think about that when you're trying to identify this guy. And then you'll find it oftentimes on these kind of organic soils on the forest floor there. But let's think about that Latin name, robusta. What does that refer to? And that refers to the fact that this looks like it looks like a really kind of thick cylindrical moss. It looks pretty chunky and substantial when you find it. And when you see it sitting on the ground as well, you know, as you can see in this photo on the right, it does branch, but you really don't see the branching at all when you're just looking at it. To me, when I find this moss out in the forest, it always looks like a big group of caterpillars that have kind of crawled out of the earth and they're looking straight up at the moon. And so think about all those little caterpillars looking up at the moon. That is your Pipecleaner moss there. Really cylindrical looking. That is opposed to our flat moss, Buckiella undulata, also called wavy-leaved cotton moss, just for your own pleasure and delight. So, wavy-leaved cotton moss, this is one that it loves to grow kind of above the ground. You see it growing on sort of rocks, you see it growing on dead wood, lots of sites like this. And from a distance, it might look superficially similar to the Pipecleaner moss that we were just talking about. However, as the name suggests, flat moss, super flat, Pipecleaner moss, really very cylindrical looking. Now, another way to potentially identify this from a distance, is that your flat moss, or Buckiella undulata, also tends to be really light colored. So it'll be like a really light green over to almost a whitish. You can almost see like it's whitish in this photo here. And really what it looks like is, it looks like somebody took a healthy patch of some other moss, like Pipecleaner moss, and they went and they sat on it, or they, had a picnic on it. They drove a car on it, and they squashed it and made it look, kind of crappy. Well, that actually didn't happen, probably. That's just the way it looks. It's this really light color, really squashed looking. And what this photo illustrates is how flat it is. So the leaves, they're these kind of broader leaves, and they come off either side like this. They don't come out forwards and they don't come out backwards. It's very two-dimensional moss. Also, one more thing. This moss doesn't tend to have very obvious branching. So very flat looking, not so obvious branching. And in this photo, you can just kind of see some of the sporophytes coming off from the sides, because once again, this is another pleurocarpus moss. Okay, we are moving from our pleurocarpus into our acrocarpus mosses now, people. The way I remember, which is which, so the acrocarpus mosses, those are the ones a little bit more like tiny trees, and the sporophytes coming up from the top. And if you think about the Latin, you think about acro means high. Acrophobia is the fear of heights. So that sporophyte, it's way up at the very top of that moss there. Okay, first of all, we have our large leafy moss, Rhizomnium glabrescens. So breaking down that name, leafy, it has these very broad leaves here. This is a moss where you can really clearly see the leaves with your naked eye. Yeah, it's really cool. It's a really cute little plant when you find it out in the woods. It's really hard to see some of the other mosses' leaves. This one, it's got these really big leaves. Large though, this actually isn't, it's not the biggest leafy moss in the forest. It's not even the biggest leafy moss in this course. That's a little bit of a misnomer there for your large leafy moss. Okay. Looking at this, so you can see the sporophytes in this photo right here coming right out from the top of the moss there. It's got kind of and then you can see in this photo on the right here, the leaves occur in kind of these whorls right at the very tippy top of the little plant there. And where do you find this moss? You often find this moss in really damp areas. It loves to grow on nurse logs, and it loves to grow in kind of really sheltered places above the ground. It loves wet spots. And just a photo to illustrate some of those sporophytes. You can see the sporophytes coming out from the tippy top of the gametophyte there because they're acrocarpous. And you can see the leaves occurring in kind of these whorl structures at the very top there. Another thing, no branching on this moss. You just have a leaf coming straight out from a single stalk. Okay, coastal leafy moss. Plagiomnium insigne. I think another name for this is badge moss, and insigne, that's what that refers to. So coastal leafy moss, this is a bigger moss than our large leafy moss, believe it or not. Both super leafy though. Looks kind of similar in many respects. So they both don't branch at all, and they've got the big leaves just coming straight out from the stalk there. One bomb-proof way to tell this apart from the large leafy moss is if you're able to get your magnifier and take a close look at those leaves though. And the leaves of the coastal leafy moss are serrated around the margins there. You can see that here. The leaves on the large leafy moss, not serrated. They have entire margins. But the easier way is if you're able to really distinguish just the shape of the gametophyte. So the coastal leafy moss produces these sterile gametophytes. They look a little bit like tiny little ferns with the big leaves coming out from the side there. They're sort of bending over and they taper to a point at the tip there. And then they produce also these fertile gametophytes here. These ones look more similar to the large leafy moss. So bomb-proof way to identify this into the field, you're going to want to look for these sterile fronds, these sterile little gametophytes, I mean, and those look quite different from the large leafy moss. Okay, here's just a mess of coastal leafy moss growing up on this log over here, and you can see a few of the sterile gametophytes right here. Over here you can see a lot more of the fertile gametophytes. You might even have a few large leafy moss thrown in there as well. Okay, next up, Menzies tree moss, Leucolepsis menziesii. Another Menzies species. Remember, Menzies the great botanist. So this is one, we've had a few tricky ones to distinguish apart. This is one pretty easy when you get onto it. And that is because you pick up a little gametophyte of your Menzies tree moss there, and it's like if you asked a child to draw a tree, and basically they would draw a big bare trunk, and then they would put all the little branches with leaves right at the end there. Such is the way with the Menzies tree moss. It has this big bare part here, so it's got like this big bare stem, and all of the leaves are clumped right at the tippy top. Pretty easy, pretty distinctive looking. However, one thing is going to make this a little bit complicated. So we're talking about Menzies tree moss in this course. There's another thing out there which is just called tree moss, and it looks quite similar. I don't know if its SMR, SNR values are different or not, but you want to be able to distinguish between those two. What you're going to look at then is you're going to look at the sporophyte. Now, with your just plain tree moss, the sporophyte, the little capsule on the end, is standing right erect at the top there. Your Menzies tree moss, the capsule on the end of the sporophyte is drooping, and that's what you can see in this photo right here. So this is the sporophyte of the Menzies tree moss with the droopy capsules right on the tippy top there. Next up, Dusky fork moss, Dicranum fuscesens. our dusky fork moss, the trick to identifying this one is to look at the leaves. So it doesn't produce any branches, it produces these big, long, tendrily leaves though. And the leaves are all typically pointing off in a single direction. And that's how we distinguish the dusky fork moss from some of the other dicranums that you might find out there. All of those leaves tend to be kind of pointed one way as if there was a wind blowing. So that's what you can see in this photo here. It's got those really noodly long tendril-like leaves, a little bit of fuzz. And then you can see on the right here, took this photo and you can see how they're all going off one way. Tendrily leaves going off in one direction. And finally, our peat moss. Sphagnum species plural. We're not talking about any particular species of peat moss. We're talking about, kind of all of them. We're talking about the entire genus, because all of them have, there's fine distinctions between them, but all of them basically like super, super wet places with really poor soils. You typically find all of them in bogs, and because they like these super wet places with poor soils, they grow in areas that have really, really low rates of decomposition. And the result of this is that organic matter just doesn't get decomposed and it gets preserved there. And so in these peat bogs, you'll have accumulations of old peat moss that might be meters and meters thick. It might be super, super thick. And actually, back in some places, like I believe the Vikings did this, was they would actually mummify people in peat bogs. They would do like human sacrifices or bury dead in peat bogs, and they would last there forever. They would be mummified, kind of like, the mummies in Egypt. And now archaeologists can dig these remains up, and they've got perfectly preserved remains there. Another thing about the peat bogs is because you have this huge accumulation of organic matter, it's actually, I think, the richest carbon sink on planet Earth. Per unit area, it can store more carbon than anywhere else. So a really ecologically unique, really distinctive area formed by this peat moss here. Now, how do we tell our peat moss apart from the others? So this, I think peat moss falls in the taxonomy. It's its own thing. It's like at a very, very high up level. I think it's in its own class or order. But basically, first of all, look at the sporophytes at the very top there. Now, the sporophytes of all of the other mosses that we've looked at were really tall, the capsule on the top, eh? The sporophytes for peat moss tend to be really, really short, and so you can barely see them poking out sometimes. You can see the sporophytes at the top of this one here. Another thing is that on the peat moss, you have all these branches which are occurring in these fascicle bundles. That's a point where where you have multiple branches coming out from a single point. So you can see on this illustration, we've got 3 branches coming out per point there. And with these branches, they'll have some of the cells will be used for photosynthesizing. They've got lots of chlorophyll. Other cells are dead, and their only purpose is to store water. And peat mosses they're actually sort of ecosystem engineers because they will store lots and lots of water inside themselves, and then they hold on to that, and so that their area stays wet even when the surrounding environment dries out. And because of this, a little bit of ethnobotany, this was the most, studies, anthropologists kind of think that a lot of First Nations folks didn't distinguish that much between certain species of moss, but sphagnum moss or peat moss was always really, really important because it could be used like a sponge, it could be used like a menstrual pad. Anything that you required something to hold water, you needed its absorbency. It was used for that. Now, all these branches, These grow out of this big head at the tippy top there called the capitulum. And that's where all the new branches grow out of. And when you see it from a distance, it often looks like a star with many, many little points. And you look straight down onto it. And so it's a very distinctive looking moss. And yeah, really makes these really interesting ecosystems. Okay, mosses are hard. So when I was learning the mosses basically for this course, I made a little dichotomous key to try and help myself keep them straight, and so that's what this is right here, and I hope that it gives you, it's valuable for you as well. But that is it. That is our last group of plants for the course, guys. Thanks for coming on this indicator plant journey with myself, and I hope that you go review your mosses, try and find some in the wild, come to lab, and just go live your best life. Take care.